I wanted to talk to y'all today about one of my very favorite educational techniques, and that is a spiraling curriculum. If I were to have a soapbox to stand on, this would be it. I really truly believe if we redid our math curriculum to include more of a spiraling curriculum, a lot of the issues that we see in America with I don't like math, I'm not good at math, those things would literally just go away. Spiraling curriculum is a way to help your students with the retention of information. So you guys probably see it in the grades where you are. I definitely see it in the grades where I am. So in eighth grade, you guys do an amazing job with geometry. You teach terms, you teach vocabulary, you teach processes, you teach thinking. And then when those same students show up in 10th grade geometry, they look scared and blankly at their teacher as if they have never heard any of these words before ever. We see the same thing between Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. In Algebra 1, the students learn factoring, they learn completing the square, all these different things. And then in Algebra 2 last year, when I gave my students my pretest, my SLO last year was on factoring. When I gave the students the pretest, 100% of my students scored a 0 on factoring, even though they had all quote unquote mastered factoring in Algebra 1. So what's going on? Why is it that our students do not retain any of the information that we teach them, or at least much of the information, I should say, that we teach them from year to year? Well, one person who was curious about that was a man named John Saxon. And John Saxon was a retired military person turned educator, and he really did some investigation, he did some research, and he said the reason why our students are not retaining is not because of anything wrong with the student. The problem is the way the curriculum is being presented. It is presented in choppy little chapters. And so in chapter 1, we're going to do, say, factoring. And then we're not going to do factoring again until Algebra 2. So of course, between Algebra 1 and Algebra 2, we forget how to factor. The same thing with geometry. Geometry is perhaps chapter 9. We don't talk about geometry before chapter 9. We don't talk about geometry after chapter 9. We only talk about geometry during chapter 9. And so therefore, our students forget it. On the other hand, probably every one of you guys knows your single digit addition facts. That's a first grade standard. Why didn't you forget that? Well, you didn't forget it because in first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, all the way up through this year, you have done single digit addition. You cannot forget it because it comes up all the time. And that's the same kind of idea behind Saxon Math. Well, I was first introduced to Saxon Math as an 11th grader. The school that I went to adopted his textbook for my pre-cal class, and oh my goodness, it was revolutionary. That was the moment when my whole view of mathematics education changed. This textbook was, in fact, so amazing that my classmates went to the headmaster of my school and requested that he adopt Saxon Math for calculus because it was so awesome. At that point, Saxon Math was brand new and there was no calculus book. It wasn't an option, but that just tells you the power of this curriculum when the students are stepping forward and saying, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So other people have then copied his ideas, just that he was the first. Saxon Math basically runs under the premise that if we continue to review, then our students won't forget because it will come up again and again and again, just like your single digit addition facts. And that's the basis behind a spiral curriculum, no matter what subject it is, no matter who the publisher is. The spiraling curriculum basically says, I have this group of skills that I need to learn. There's specific content, there are specific standards, there are different things that I need to do. And so the teacher is going to introduce whatever the topic is. Now, on the first pass at that topic, many of the students are going to understand. Some of them are not. So we need to go back, spiral around again, and we're going to talk about that same topic, perhaps from a slightly different perspective, perhaps give it a different context, but we're just talking about that same thing. Now, more of our students understand because they had the opportunity to go back and redo. And those people who understood the first time, they weren't allowed to forget it because they had to go back over it again. And then we're going to cover some other things and we're going to spiral back around. Here we are again, third pass at that same topic. And now even more of our students understand. And the first people who understood and the second people who understood had their knowledge deepened or reminded so that they can continue to remember how to do that. So think about that in the context of parachute packing. Kind of a strange example, but think about it in this context. So this is a group of students at parachute packing school. We have 3 students, cleverly named A, B, and C. So student A, you can see, started off amazingly well, made 95 on their first parachute packing test. But then look what happened after that. They're kind of bouncing around. We repacked the parachutes, and sometimes they do well, and sometimes they don't. All right, student C also did amazingly well, but then student C didn't think he needed to practice anymore, and you can see that his packing ability is definitely diminishing. On the other hand, student B down here, he did awful. He failed his first parachute packing and his second and his third. But he kept trying and he kept practicing and he kept learning. And by the end of the semester, he's up to the 95 that his classmates started with. Now, if we average their grades, if we do the mean, all 3 of those students ended up with a 70. If today is jump out of the airplane day and one of these 3 students has to pack your parachute, which one would you want to pack your parachute? Probably you picked student C because student C has continuously gotten better and is now mastering that skill fairly consistently. That's the idea behind a spiraling curriculum. If you fail the first attempt at factoring, it doesn't really matter in the long run. What matters is by the time you get to Algebra 2, you are an amazing factorer and you can remember how to factor and you carry that knowledge with you forward into Algebra 2 and Algebra 3 and pre-calculus and on and on and on because that now is something that you are good at, that you can follow through with. So there were some studies done by Harvard. I had a guest speaker that came from Nation Ford several years ago to speak in our class, and that teacher has now moved. Her husband was going to law school, so she's moved out of state. But these are some things that she left for me to share with you guys. From the research that she did and studies that she looked up, things that inhibit learning in our classroom, if we include behaviors in academic grades. So that might mean I'm going to give you extra credit if you bring me a box of Kleenexes or bring in some wipes for the classroom or whatever. Those things have nothing to do with mathematics, and therefore you should not be given grades for those sorts of things. The second thing is giving assessments that are not linked to your learning goals, which in our case are the standards that we're required to teach. All of your assessments should come from and be tied to those standards that you are given. Grading formative assessment. So this is a big deal when students are first learning something, like that student who failed his first parachute packing thing. That assessment, if it was a formative assessment, should have just been okay, we're not very good at this, let's move on. Now, obviously, once you get into it, you have to start doing some grading, but formative assessment is not the place for those grades. Now, this last one is one that I would like to experiment with. I've never quite figured out how to do it within the constraints of what we have here in the Rock Hill School District, but somehow the older scores should be less weighty than the more recent scores. Because if you made a 40 on your first attempt at parachute packing, but you made 95, 96, and 98 on the last 3, those should count more because that's where you are now. Where you used to be in September is not quite as important as where you are now in April and May as we're finishing up the school year. All right, 2 things according to Harvard that help improve teaching the most: enhancing student awareness of the big picture, and we're going to look at a way to do that, and then helpful regular feedback for mid-course correction. So if you have a student who is not doing well in factoring, for example, if you're an 8th grade Algebra 1 teacher, not doing well in factoring, that student needs to become aware of the fact that he or she is not doing well in factoring and also given the opportunity to fix that as you move forward. So here is an example from the Saxon pre-algebra book. So this would be 7th grade or 8th grade, depending on whether you're advanced or not advanced. This is problem set 62, which is proportions with fractions. So you can see that these first 2 are proportional fraction questions. You could solve these down here with proportions and they have fractions. These would make into fractions. These are already fractions. But then look at all these other things. This has nothing to do with proportions with fractions. Why is it there? Well, in past lessons, you have learned how to multiply and divide and add and subtract fractions. We better not forget that before we go to Algebra 1. We better keep practicing. In previous lessons, you've learned about exponents and roots. Better not forget that. We got to keep practicing before you get to Algebra 1. In geometry, we've learned how to find area and volume and surface area. Better not forget that. You guys got geometry coming up in a couple years. Least common multiple, we can't forget that. We're going to have to learn how to do factoring and how to find common denominators. And I need this information in order to do that. So the book is designed so that you practice a little bit on the new stuff and you practice a lot on the old stuff because we never want to forget. So I have never had the privilege of having a spiraling textbook except when I was homeschooling and I got to pick whatever I wanted. So when I was teaching out of a textbook, this was a typical homework assignment that I might have given. Now that I'm using Delta Math, this is an assignment that my students have for this upcoming week. I picked completing the square because for you guys teaching Algebra 1, this is something that you will do. But look at all these other things that my students are doing that is not completing the square. Look at all these other assignments that are coming off of different pages besides the ones that we covered today, because I never want them to forget. I want them to move forward from my class into the next class, remembering all the material that they need to be successful. So creating a self-monitoring chart is a good idea. I'm not doing that this year due to time constraints, but I have many years in the past. It basically is a list of the standards. And then when you write your test, each test question has a standard written next to it. And then the student evaluates on the test on this day, I got that right. That same topic was on the test on this day, and I still remember. This one, I got it right the first time, but when I retested, I forgot. So I better go back and restudy that. And the goal is by the end of the year, I've got all kind of yeses in this last column. So I let my students do smiley faces or frowny faces, whatever they want besides yes and no. And the goal is by the last part of the year that this column is full of positives, yeses, smiley faces, whatever. So lots of different ways that you can incorporate a spiraling curriculum into what you do. If you have a warm-up, maybe your warm-up is going to be back over practice problems. I do this all the time. My warm-ups are not necessarily related to what I'm doing that day in class because what I want them to do is practice, practice, practice the skills that they have. This is not the lesson hook. That's totally different. This is just some warm-up problems for them to do while I'm checking roll or passing out paper or whatever. I especially do this in my IB class because they have that big test coming up at the end of the year. But I do that in my grade level tests, grade level classes as well, because they're going to have to take a final exam. And also, my students, my 12th graders, are going to take college placement tests. They're going to take college algebra next year. I need them to be prepared for those things. I can't afford for them to forget what we did in September by the time they get to take that college placement test in July of the next year. They need to still be able to do that. Review problems on tests and quizzes. I do a ton of this, and that way those older material is still getting graded, so it's sort of like it's getting more weight because it's graded more frequently. Review questions and homework, you guys saw that. If I can have a review day built into another unit, maybe part of the class is on a field trip or part of the class had to take a test yesterday, a standardized test, and I don't have anything new that I want to do while their brains are tired from that standardized test. These are good ways to build in review days. You can take advantage of or create your own teachable moments. In the middle of one lesson, sometimes you need a prior skill, so that's a great time to bring it back up. Sometimes a student will just ask you a question that opens up the opportunity to go back and practice an older skill. But anytime you can bring up those review type things, please take advantage of those opportunities. You want your students not just to be successful in 7th grade, right? The goal for 7th grade should not be to pass 7th grade. Hopefully none of y'all students are withdrawing from school at the end of 7th grade. Hopefully they're moving on to 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. So what you want is for them to be successful next year. What you want is for them to be successful 2 years from now. You want them to remember the things that you taught them as they move forward and not have to have their teachers go back and reteach the things that they have forgotten from your class. You want them to go forward positive.